My son sold his house and handed his wife $940,000 like it was candy to be burned. When all the money was gone, they showed up at my doorstep with suitcases, smiling as if my home was theirs to claim. I told them no. And her answer? My daughter-in-law struck me across the face in my own living room. I didn't shout, I didn't strike back. Instead, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer before the day was over. A few days later, when the court summons arrived, her arrogance turned to panic. Now, before I share what happened next, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving it a thumbs up. The morning they arrived started like any other Sunday in March. I was sitting in my kitchen, coffee steaming in the mug my late wife had given me 20 years ago, when I heard the car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I watched Garrett struggle with 2 oversized suitcases, while Marlene checked her reflection in her phone screen. She wore a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her hair was freshly styled in those perfect waves that only money could buy. Even from inside, I could see the Hermes bag hanging from her arm, the one she'd posted about on Instagram just last week. The morning sun caught the gold clasps, making them gleam like accusations. Garrett had called me the night before, his voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12 and had broken my father's watch. He said they needed to stay for a while, just until they got back on their feet. When I asked about the money from his grandmother's house sale, the line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then Marlene's voice came through, bright and dismissive, saying investments take time to mature, and family helps family. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed. I knew then that something was terribly wrong, though I couldn't have imagined how wrong. They didn't knock when they reached my door. Marlene walked in first, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors like she owned the place, while Garrett followed behind with his head down. The smell of her perfume filled my living room immediately, that expensive Chanel scent that seemed to announce her presence before she even spoke. She surveyed my home with calculating eyes, already deciding which room would be theirs, which closet would hold her designer clothes. I stood up from my chair slowly, my 68-year-old knees protesting slightly, and faced them both. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the diamonds in Marlene's earrings, making them sparkle like tiny accusations. "Dad, we need to stay here for a while," Garrett said, still unable to meet my eyes. His voice sounded hollow, like something inside him had broken and couldn't be fixed. I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he set down the suitcases, and his wedding ring looked loose on his finger, as if he'd lost weight recently. Behind them, I could see more bags in the car, evidence of a move that was supposed to be temporary but looked permanent. The way Marlene had already started moving my mail from the side table told me she'd been planning this moment, rehearsing how she'd take over my space just like she'd taken over my son's life. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in months. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt in a way that spoke of sleepless nights and constant stress. His shirt hung loose on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't hide. This wasn't the confident software engineer who'd graduated with honors, who'd built successful applications for major companies. This was a man who'd been worn down, leaving only a shell that moved and spoke, but had no fight left in him. The transformation was shocking, and I felt my anger rising not at him, but at the woman who'd done this to him. "You sold your grandmother's house for $940,000 3 months ago," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Where did it go?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Marlene's laugh was like glass breaking, sharp and jarring in the quiet morning. She moved further into my living room, running her manicured fingers along my bookshelf, leaving traces in the dust I hadn't noticed was there. Her nails were perfectly done, of course, probably a $300 manicure that would last 2 weeks before she'd need another one. "Investments take time," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The digital economy moves differently than your generation understands. She picked up a photo of my late wife, examined it briefly, then set it down carelessly in the wrong spot. The casual disrespect made my jaw clench. I could see Garrett flinch at her tone, the way he always did when she talked down to people. But he said nothing, just stood there like a child waiting to be punished, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The truth was written all over Garrett's face, in the way his shoulders slumped when she spoke, in the way he flinched when she touched his arm possessively. His eyes had dark circles underneath them that makeup couldn't hide, and his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee cup. I'd suspected something was wrong when he'd sold the house so quickly after the funeral, barely 3 weeks after we'd put my mother in the ground. But I'd attributed it to grief, to wanting to move forward, to needing a fresh start after losing the grandmother who'd raised him. Now I could see the manipulation clearly, like watching a puppet show where the strings had suddenly become visible. The way she controlled him with touches and glances, her fingers always on his wrist or shoulder, steering him like a ship. The way he shrank under her attention, becoming smaller with each possessive gesture. The morning light streaming through my kitchen window made everything sharper, clearer, like a photograph coming into focus after being blurry for too long. The kitchen still smelled of the bacon I'd been cooking when they'd arrived, the grease cooling in the pan on the stove. Normal Sunday morning smells that now felt like they belonged to a different life before I'd understood what was really happening. Marlene stood in my mother's kitchen, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor that my mother had chosen 30 years ago, refusing to update because it still worked perfectly fine. The contrast was jarring, this woman with her $800 shoes standing where my mother had stood in her house slippers, making breakfast for 50 years. "No," I said, the word coming out clear and firm, cutting through her rehearsed speech about family obligations. "You can't stay here." The surprise on Marlene's face was almost worth what came next. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose, her glossed lips parting in shock. She'd expected me to fold immediately, to open my doors and my wallet like Garrett always did, like everyone in her life probably did when faced with her particular combination of beauty and manipulation. But I'd built my construction business from nothing, laying foundation and framing houses with my own hands until I could afford to hire crews. I'd survived 2 recessions that had destroyed bigger companies, weathered a divorce that had cost me half of everything, and raised 2 sons mostly on my own. I knew users when I saw them, could spot them the way a carpenter could spot termite damage. My mother hadn't worked her entire life as a seamstress, her fingers cramped from years of hemming and taking in clothes, so her great-grandson's wife could burn through the inheritance on designer goods and failed business ventures. The slap came faster than I expected from someone wearing designer heels and a silk dress. Her palm connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot, the sound sharp enough to make Garrett gasp and step backward. The burning sensation spread across my face immediately, hot and stinging, like someone had pressed a heated iron against my skin. My eyes watered involuntarily from the impact, and I could taste copper in my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. But what hurt more than the physical pain was that Garrett stood frozen by the refrigerator, didn't move to defend me or restrain his wife, just watched with wide, frightened eyes like a child witnessing something he couldn't process. His hands hung useless at his sides, and I saw in that moment how completely she'd broken him down. "You selfish old man!" Marlene screamed, her perfect composure finally cracking like expensive china dropped on concrete. Her face had turned red, veins standing out on her neck as she continued shouting. "Family helps family! That's what family does! You're sitting on all that money while we're struggling!" I touched my cheek, feeling the heat radiating from where she'd struck me, the skin already beginning to swell. My fingers came away with a small smear of blood from where her ring had caught the skin. I pulled out my phone without breaking eye contact with her, watching as her expression shifted from rage to something like concern. She thought I was calling the police. I could see it in the way her eyes widened slightly, the way she took a small step back toward Garrett, her hand reaching for his arm. But I had something different in mind. Something that would do more than just document assault. I scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in years, someone from my military days who'd transitioned into a very different kind of service after leaving the Army. Vincent had been in intelligence, then private investigation, and now worked in what he called financial recovery services. His number was still there, saved under his old military nickname. The phone rang twice before he answered, his voice immediately alert despite it being Sunday morning. "I need you here today," I said when he answered, loud enough for Marlene and Garrett to hear every word. "Yes, today. I know it's Sunday. It involves $940,000 and assault." I gave him my address and hung up, noting how Marlene's face had gone pale at the mention of the exact amount. While we waited for Vincent to arrive, I didn't say another word. I went to the freezer and wrapped ice in a dish towel, the cold burning almost as much as the heat from the slap. I sat back down in my chair, the old wooden one that creaked when I shifted my weight, held the ice pack to my face, and watched them squirm. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking each uncomfortable second. Marlene kept checking her phone, her manicured nails clicking against the screen as she typed. Furiously, probably trying to figure out her next move, or maybe warning her brother about what was happening. Her movements were jerky, nervous, nothing like the smooth confidence she'd displayed when she'd first walked in. Garrett stood by the window, staring out at the bird feeder in the backyard, occasionally opening his mouth like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. His reflection in the glass looked ghostly, translucent, like he was already disappearing. A cardinal landed on the feeder, its red feathers bright against the morning sky, and Garrett watched it with the kind of focus people use when they're trying not to think about what's happening around them. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point, heavy with everything that had been broken and couldn't be fixed. The refrigerator hummed, the ice maker dropped cubes with a clatter that made Marlene jump, and still nobody spoke. I noticed Marlene kept glancing at the door, her body angled toward it, as if calculating whether to leave before my contact arrived. Her designer purse was still on the counter, where she'd set it with such confidence earlier, but now her hand kept drifting toward it, ready to grab and run. Each time a car passed on the street outside, she tensed, her shoulders rising slightly. Garrett noticed too, and I saw him mouth something to her, probably telling her they should leave, but she shook her head sharply. My old friend Vincent arrived 2 hours later in his unmarked sedan, a gray Toyota that looked like every other car on the street, but had modifications I knew about from our past. He looked exactly the same as he had 20 years ago, except for more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. He wore a simple black suit that could have belonged to a funeral director or federal agent, deliberately ambiguous. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. I knew that much from our occasional contact over the years. He'd moved into more specialized work, the kind that required skills from our military days combined with legal knowledge and connections in places most people didn't know existed. Vincent took photos of my face with a camera that looked more sophisticated than a phone, documenting the mark Marlene had left from multiple angles. The swelling had gotten worse, and I could feel my eye beginning to close. He recorded my statement with professional efficiency, asking specific questions about timing and witnesses, about what had been said before and after the assault. His recorder was the expensive kind that picked up every sound, every nervous breath from Garrett, every angry exhale from Marlene. But his real interest emerged when I mentioned the money, the $940,000 that had disappeared. His eyes sharpened like a predator catching a scent. As he made his calls and sent his messages, I watched my son crumble a little more with each passing minute. The reality was setting in, the understanding that this wasn't going to end with a simple apology and moving on. Marlene had crossed a line, and I was going to make sure she understood exactly how far she'd fallen. The money might be gone, but justice has a way of finding its own payment. The crack of her palm against my cheek still echoed in my ears, and Garrett's frozen silence hurt even more than the slap itself. The next morning, my lawyer friend's office looked like a paper storm had blown through it. Documents covered every surface, each one another piece of evidence in a puzzle that was becoming clearer by the hour. He'd brought in someone he only referred to as a financial crimes specialist, a quiet woman who studied the papers with the intensity of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Garrett sat across from me, his face pale, as they explained what they'd found in just one night of investigation. The speed of their work told me this wasn't their first time dealing with this kind of situation. The specialist traced transactions with her finger across the papers, showing us how $940,000 had moved through various accounts in a matter of weeks. The pattern suggested someone knew exactly what they were doing. But there were mistakes, too. Careless errors that left trails. Every transaction was logged, every transfer recorded, creating a path that led to some very interesting places. Garrett admitted that Marlene had always insisted on managing their money, said she had a better head for numbers, that his job was to earn, and hers was to invest. Vera called while we were reviewing the documents. She'd been my friend for 30 years, worked at a bank before retiring, and still had connections throughout the financial world. She'd seen Marlene at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, meeting with someone in the lobby restaurant. The interesting part wasn't the meeting itself, but how nervous Marlene seemed, constantly checking her phone, jumping whenever it rang. Vera had watched for an hour, saw Marlene exchange a manila envelope with the stranger, saw her hands shake as she took whatever was given in return. The stranger's face had been hidden by a hat, but Vera noted they moved with confidence, like someone who'd done this many times before. That afternoon, Vera sent me a photo that made my blood run cold. It showed Marlene at a storage facility on the outskirts of town, loading boxes into a unit. But in the background, barely visible, was another car with someone watching her. Professional surveillance, the kind that meant someone else was interested in what my daughter-in-law was doing. The lawyer studied the photo for a long time, before making another call to someone he wouldn't name. The conversation was brief, lots of careful words, but his face grew more serious with each exchange. My son broke down when the specialist showed him evidence of signatures that weren't quite his. The handwriting was close, but not perfect, like someone had practiced copying it, but couldn't quite master the way he curved his letters. Marlene had been signing his name for months, maybe years, creating a paper trail that led directly back to him while keeping her own name relatively clean. She'd made him the face of whatever was happening while she pulled the strings from behind. The realization hit him hard, and I watched my strong son sob like a child who'd just discovered Santa wasn't real. The lawyer's strategy began to take shape as he explained the options. File assault charges immediately to get Marlene into the system. A straightforward case with clear evidence, and my marked face as proof. But he hinted at something bigger, said his contacts were very interested in the pattern of transactions they'd uncovered. The assault charge would be processed through federal court, not state, a detail that seemed important, though he wouldn't explain why yet. Federal court meant federal investigators, meant resources that local police couldn't match. That evening, Garrett came to my house alone. Marlene was staying at a hotel, spending money they supposedly didn't have on a suite that cost $400 a night. He looked worse than he had the day before, the weight of betrayal adding years to his face. He told me things had been wrong for months, that Marlene had become secretive, paranoid even. She'd started taking calls in private, meeting people he didn't know, always with explanations that didn't quite make sense. He'd attributed it to stress from her business ventures, but now he wondered if there had been signs he'd chosen to ignore. We sat at my kitchen table. The same one where he'd done his homework as a child, where his grandmother had taught him to play cards, where so many family memories had been made. He told me about the small things he'd noticed but dismissed, like finding Marlene researching bankruptcy law on her laptop, or the new cell phone she'd gotten but claimed was for business. There were pills in their medicine cabinet he didn't recognize, supplements, she said, but the labels were partly scratched off. His wedding ring sat on the table between us, removed for the first time since his wedding day 4 years ago. The specialist called that night with preliminary findings that changed everything. The money hadn't just disappeared. It had been systematically moved through a network designed to hide its destination. But more importantly, this wasn't the first time this pattern had appeared in their investigations. Similar cases had popped up in other states, always involving family members, always with the same careful structure. Someone was teaching this method, and Marlene was just one student among many. The implications made my stomach turn. Vera's banking connections revealed another disturbing detail. Marlene had been trying to book flights to Miami, one-way tickets for next month, but only one ticket. She wasn't planning to take Garrett with her when she ran. The reservation was under her maiden name, paid for with a credit card Garrett didn't know existed. When Vera dug deeper, she found similar tickets booked to other destinations, all one way, all in Marlene's name alone. The woman who claimed to love my son was planning to abandon him after destroying his life. The surveillance photo from the storage unit took on new meaning when the lawyer's investigator enhanced it. The person watching Marlene was definitely professional, someone trained in this kind of work. There were more photos, dozens of them, showing Marlene at banks, at hotels, at meetings with people Garrett didn't recognize. In every photo, she seemed to be conducting business that had nothing to do with wellness apps or digital investments. The storage unit itself was registered under a false name, paid for in cash, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Garrett's confession that night was the hardest thing I'd ever heard from my son. He told me how Marlene had convinced him to sell his grandmother's house just 2 weeks after the funeral, when grief was still fresh, and his judgment clouded. She'd said it was what his grandmother would have wanted, to invest in their future, to build something lasting with the money. She'd cried with him, held him, made him believe she understood his loss. But while he was mourning, she was calculating, moving pieces into place for something much darker than simple theft. Money leaves fingerprints, the specialist had said. And now I understood what she meant. Every dollar of my mother's money had left a trace, a digital footprint that led through a maze of deception. But those same fingerprints would be Marlene's undoing. She thought she'd been clever, thought she'd covered her tracks, but she'd underestimated the power of modern financial forensics. She'd also underestimated something else, something more important. She'd underestimated a father's determination to protect his son and honor his mother's memory. The text from the lawyer that ended the day was brief, but powerful. Federal prosecutor is interested. Very interested. Also, the person watching your daughter-in-law? They're on our side. Meet tomorrow for details. I looked at my son, saw him reading the same message on his phone, saw the first flicker of hope in his eyes in months. Marlene thought she'd won, thought the slap had been her moment of triumph. But she was about to learn that some fingerprints can't be wiped clean, and some crimes can't be hidden behind designer clothes and Instagram filters. The lawyer's final words before leaving echoed in my mind as I tried to sleep that night. "This is going to get complicated," he'd said. "But when it's over, everyone will know exactly what she did and how she did it. Justice might not bring back the money, but sometimes public exposure of evil is its own form of payment." The process server found Marlene exactly where social media said she'd be, in front of 800 Instagram followers during her live morning meditation session. She'd positioned herself on the balcony of her $400 a night hotel suite, the city skyline behind her, wearing white linen that probably cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Through the screen, her followers could see her peaceful smile, the gentle way she moved her hands as she talked about manifesting abundance and releasing negative energy. They couldn't see the credit card statements piling up, the desperate texts she'd been sending to someone she called her advisor, or the panic that flashed in her eyes every time her phone buzzed. The knock on her door came at exactly 10:15, right when she was telling her audience about the importance of family support and surrounding yourself with positive energy. The process server had done their homework, knowing she'd be alive at that exact moment, making it impossible for her to ignore the summons. Her followers started commenting about the interruption, some joking that negative energy was literally knocking at her door. She excused herself gracefully, told them she'd be right back, left the camera running because she never missed a chance to seem authentic and unfiltered. The process server was a young woman, professional and polite, who'd clearly done this many times before. The live stream picked up her voice clearly saying, "You're being served," followed by Marlene's sharp intake of breath. The comments on the live stream exploded immediately, viewers asking what was happening, if this was real, if Marlene was okay. Some recognized what being served meant, started speculating about divorce, lawsuits, family drama that was far more interesting than meditation. The viewer count started climbing rapidly as word spread across social media platforms. Marlene tried to maintain her composure as she walked back to the camera, envelope in hand, her face a mask of calm that didn't quite reach her eyes. She laughed, the sound brittle and forced, and told her followers this was just family drama, that her bitter father-in-law couldn't accept their success. She waved the envelope like it was nothing, a prop in her performance, something to be dismissed and forgotten. But her hands were shaking slightly, and those who watched carefully could see the moment she glanced at the return address and recognized the federal courthouse stamp. The stream ended abruptly after that, cutting off mid-sentence as she promised to address everything in her next video. Off camera, away from her audience, Marlene tore open the envelope with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. Assault charges, filed in federal court, with a preliminary hearing date in 2 weeks. Her mind raced as she read through the legal language, trying to understand why a simple assault case would go to federal court instead of state. The maximum penalties listed made her stomach turn, but it was the federal jurisdiction that really scared her. She'd prepared for the possibility of local charges and had even consulted with a lawyer friend about potential defenses. But federal court was different, meaning investigators with resources she couldn't match. Garrett found out about the serving from one of his co-workers who followed Marlene online. The video had already been screen recorded and was spreading across social media, people dissecting every moment, every expression on Marlene's face. He watched it in his car during lunch break and saw his wife lie to hundreds of people about him, about his father, about everything. The comments were brutal, divided between those supporting Marlene and those calling out obvious lies. He recognized usernames of their friends, people from their wedding, all witnessing this humiliation. Some were asking if he was okay, if the marriage was in trouble, if the rumors about money problems were true. That evening, Garrett came to my house with his laptop, showing me the viral video and the online reaction. Marlene had tried to delete it, but the internet never forgets, and copies were everywhere. Someone had even made a compilation video with dramatic music, zooming in on her face when she realized what was happening. The view count was climbing by the hour, thousands of people watching his wife get served with federal charges. He said she'd been calling him non-stop, alternating between rage and tears, demanding he make me drop the charges, threatening to reveal things about their marriage that would embarrass him. The federal contact my lawyer had mentioned turned out to be someone who introduced themselves only as an investigator, no badge shown, just someone who clearly had authority. They met us at the lawyer's office the next morning, spreading out surveillance photos that made Garrett gasp. There was Marlene at various banks, at storage facilities, at meetings in hotel lobbies. But more interesting were the photos of her with someone whose face was always carefully obscured, turned away from cameras or hidden by hats and sunglasses. This person appeared in dozens of photos over 6 months, always exchanging envelopes with Marlene, always careful to avoid identification. The investigator explained that Marlene's activities had triggered automatic alerts in the banking system months ago. The pattern of transactions suggested something beyond simple spending, something that involved multiple accounts and suspicious transfers. They'd been building a case quietly, waiting for her to make a mistake big enough to prosecute. The assault charge, the investigator said with something almost like amusement, had given them the perfect opportunity to move forward without revealing the larger investigation. It was like Marlene had handed them a gift wrapped in federal jurisdiction. Vera called while we were looking at surveillance photos, her voice excited in a way I hadn't heard in years. She'd been doing her own investigation through banking contacts and had discovered something crucial. Desmond, Marlene's brother, had suddenly left town on a flight to Vegas, buying his ticket with cash at the airport counter. But the interesting part was that he'd been trying to call Marlene repeatedly before leaving, and she hadn't answered any of his calls. Her own brother, supposedly her closest family, and she was avoiding him. Vera's contact at the airline said he'd looked panicked, kept checking over his shoulder, acted like someone running from something rather than to something. The storage unit revealed itself to be a treasure trove of evidence when the investigator got a warrant to examine it. Not just boxes of expensive purchases, but laptops, multiple cell phones, and documents that painted a picture of systematic deception. There were incorporation papers for companies Garrett had never heard of, bank statements for accounts he didn't know existed, and correspondence that showed planning going back years. But the most damning discovery was a notebook in Marlene's handwriting, detailing everything from Garrett's grandmother's declining health to estimated inheritance amounts. Garrett broke down completely when he saw the notebook, saw his grandmother referred to in cold, calculating terms. There were notes about her medical conditions, speculation about life expectancy, research about contesting wills. She'd studied him like a subject, documented his weaknesses, his habits, his emotional triggers. One page had a timeline that started with their wedding and ended with something cryptic marked only as final phase, scheduled for next month. The cruelty was methodical, systematic, completely devoid of any genuine emotion. My son finally understood that his entire marriage had been a business transaction, where he was the product being sold. The amended filing came 3 days after the first summons, delivered to Marlene's hotel by the same process server. This time there was no live stream, no audience to perform for, just Marlene alone in her expensive room with papers that spelled out federal charges that could mean 20 years in prison. The assault charge was still there, almost quaint compared to what followed. Her public defender, assigned because she could no longer access funds to hire anyone better, told her to prepare for the worst. The evidence was overwhelming, and her mysterious partner had disappeared completely, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Garrett received his own papers that day, but not what Marlene expected. Divorce papers, filed that morning, citing financial fraud and criminal activity. He'd finally found the strength to cut the last tie to the woman who'd destroyed his life. He also received something else, a victim impact statement form from the federal prosecutor asking him to document how Marlene's crimes had affected him. As he began writing, tears streaming down his face, he realized he wasn't just a victim of theft. He was a victim of a betrayal so calculated that it had stripped away his ability to trust anyone, maybe ever again. The news of federal charges spread through Marlene's social media world like wildfire. Her Instagram followers dropped by hundreds every hour, sponsors pulled out of partnerships, and the comments section became a battlefield. Someone leaked portions of the surveillance photos, showing her at the storage unit, and the wellness guru image she'd cultivated for years crumbled in days. The digital footprint she'd been so proud of became evidence of her lies. Each post about abundance and positive energy now seeming like mockery of the people she'd deceived. The live stream of her being served became her most watched video ever, but for all the wrong reasons. The meeting with the federal investigator took place in a conference room with no windows, the kind of place where serious conversations happened without interruption. The investigator placed a photograph on the table that made my blood run cold. It showed Marlene with her mysterious partner. But this time, the person's face was clearly visible. The woman in the photo looked professional, conservative even, wearing a simple business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She could have been anyone, a banker, an accountant, a consultant. But the investigator's next words changed everything about how I understood my daughter-in-law's crimes. This woman had been teaching people how to steal from elderly relatives for years, the investigator explained. She never got her hands dirty with the actual theft, always stayed one step removed from the crime. She took 30% of everything stolen, providing expertise and connections in exchange. The FBI had been trying to catch her for 2 years, but she was careful, paranoid. Never met the same person in the same place twice. She'd trained at least 7 people in different states, all following the same pattern of targeting elderly relatives with substantial assets. Marlene was just her latest student, though apparently one who'd gotten sloppier than usual. My lawyer explained the amended filing while Garrett sat in stunned silence. The federal charges now included racketeering, operating as part of a criminal enterprise, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud across state lines. These weren't charges that ended with probation or house arrest. These were charges that meant decades in federal prison, the kind of time that turned young women into old ones. The assault charge that had started everything seemed almost quaint now. A misdemeanor tacked onto felonies that would destroy not just Marlene, but potentially dozens of other people connected to this network. The investigator pulled out a laptop and showed us recorded phone calls between Marlene and her partner, captured over the past 6 months through court-ordered wiretaps related to the larger investigation. In one call, Marlene laughed about how easy it was to manipulate Garrett, how his grandmother's death had made him vulnerable, how she'd timed everything perfectly. The partner coached her through each step, reminded her to keep receipts, to document everything that could be explained as legitimate expenses. They used code words, but codes only work if investigators don't have months of recordings to decode them. The storage unit had yielded more evidence overnight as FBI technicians cracked the encrypted laptops. One contained detailed records of every dollar stolen, every transfer made, every account opened. Marlene had been meticulous in her record-keeping, probably because her partner had taught her that documentation was power, leverage in case anyone tried to double-cross her. But that same documentation now provided prosecutors with a complete map of the crime. There were also communications with banks in countries that had recently signed new cooperation treaties with the United States, meaning the money wasn't as hidden as Marlene thought. Vera arrived at the meeting with news that added another layer to the conspiracy. Through her banking contacts, she'd learned that Desmond hadn't just fled to Vegas out of fear. He'd been arrested there on unrelated gambling charges, but was already trying to make a deal, offering information about his sister's crimes in exchange for leniency. The investigator smiled at this news, said Desmond's testimony would be helpful, but unnecessary. They had enough evidence to convict Marlene multiple times over. But his cooperation would add authenticity, the voice of a co-conspirator confirming what the documents already proved. The second summons was served that afternoon, this time at Marlene's hotel restaurant, where she was meeting with a lawyer she couldn't afford. The same process server, maintaining perfect professionalism, handed over the amended filing in full view of the lunch crowd. Marlene's reaction was captured by multiple cell phones, her face going from confusion to shock to absolute terror as she read the new charges. 27 pages of detailed allegations, each one backed by evidence she didn't know existed. The lawyer she'd been trying to hire took one look at the papers and excused himself, saying this was beyond his expertise or ability to help. My lawyer had arranged for the media to be informed about the federal case, not the tabloid gossip sites, but the serious financial crime reporters who understood what this meant. By evening, articles were appearing online about the inheritance scam ring, with Marlene's Instagram photos alongside FBI evidence photos. The narrative was devastating. A wellness influencer who preached about positive energy and manifestation had systematically planned to steal nearly $1 million from her husband's dead grandmother. The public reaction was swift and merciless, with her remaining sponsors not just pulling out, but publicly denouncing her. Garrett spent that day writing his victim impact statement, each word an agony as he confronted the truth about his marriage. He wrote about how Marlene had comforted him at his grandmother's funeral while secretly celebrating the inheritance. He wrote about the months of manipulation, the careful isolation from friends who might have warned him, the constant gaslighting that made him doubt his own instincts. He wrote about finding the notebook where she'd called his grandmother the target and himself the mark, about realizing that every moment of their relationship had been a performance, a long con that started the day they met. The FBI's forensic accountants had traced $600,000 to accounts in the Bahamas, another $200,000 to the Cayman Islands, and the rest scattered across purchases that included jewelry, designer goods, and cryptocurrency. But here was the interesting part. Every transaction required dual authorization, suggesting conspiracy between Marlene and her partner. They'd thought this would protect them, ensure neither could betray the other. Instead, it created a perfect evidence trail showing both were equally guilty, equally involved in every crime. The very safeguard they'd built became the proof of their conspiracy. That evening, Marlene tried to call Garrett 43 times. When he didn't answer, she started texting, messages that ranged from threats to apologies to desperate pleas. She offered to return the money, not knowing it had already been frozen and seized. She threatened to release embarrassing information about their marriage, not knowing the FBI had already analyzed her supposed evidence and found it fabricated. She begged for forgiveness, claimed she'd been manipulated by her partner, that she was a victim too. Each message was screenshot and forwarded to my lawyer, more evidence of her desperation and continued attempts at manipulation. The investigator revealed something that changed our understanding of the timeline. The partner hadn't just been watching and coaching from afar. She'd been in our city for the past 6 months, had actually attended social events where Garrett and Marlene were present. She'd been introduced as a business consultant, had sat at their table during a charity dinner, had been in their home for a dinner party. Garrett remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman who'd seemed supportive but forgettable. The violation felt deeper knowing she'd been that close, studying them like specimens while planning to destroy their lives. Money leaves fingerprints, but so do relationships, and the connection between Marlene and her partner left traces everywhere. The investigator had found shared purchases from years ago, overlapping addresses, emergency contact forms listing each other. They'd tried to hide their connection recently, but 20 years of history doesn't disappear just because you want it to. The investigation revealed they'd known each other from college, had remained close friends, had even lived together briefly after graduation. This wasn't a recent criminal partnership, but a long relationship that had evolved into something dark. My lawyer's strategy was evolving as more evidence emerged. He was coordinating with prosecutors in 3 other states where similar crimes had occurred, building a RICO case that would treat this as organized crime. The partner wasn't just a coach or consultant. She was running a criminal enterprise that specialized in elder financial abuse. Marlene wasn't just a thief. She was part of a conspiracy that had stolen millions from vulnerable families across the country. The charges kept multiplying, each one carrying mandatory minimum sentences that added up to potential life in prison. The hotel finally evicted Marlene that night when her credit cards were declined. The frozen accounts meant she couldn't access any money, legitimate or stolen. She called Garrett from the lobby, crying, saying she had nowhere to go. He didn't answer, but I heard the voicemail later. She sounded different. The confidence gone, the manipulation replaced by genuine panic. She mentioned sleeping in her car, a Mercedes she'd leased with stolen money and could no longer pay for. The image of her in designer clothes, sleeping in a car she couldn't afford anymore, felt like the beginning of justice finally arriving. The call came at midnight, jarring me from uneasy sleep. It was Marlene, her voice different from any time I'd heard it before, raw and desperate without any of her usual calculation. She was calling from a gas station payphone because her cell service had been cut off for non-payment. She begged me to listen, said she'd return everything, said she'd sign any confession I wanted. But what really caught my attention was when she said she'd been trying to reach her partner for 12 hours and couldn't understand why she wasn't answering. The woman who'd orchestrated the theft of $940,000 still didn't know her partner had abandoned her. I didn't tell her about the arrest that had happened 3 states away. Didn't mention the $400,000 in cash her partner had tried to escape with. Instead, I listened to her sob story about sleeping in her car, about being hungry, about how everything had gone wrong. She tried to blame everyone except herself, said Garrett had pressured her to maintain a certain lifestyle, said I had never accepted her into the family, said her partner had manipulated her into the scheme. Each excuse was more pathetic than the last, the desperate flailing of someone who'd run out of lies that worked. When she finally asked if she could come to my house to talk, I told her the only place we'd talk was in court tomorrow morning. My lawyer called an hour later with updates that made the situation even more complex. The partner had started talking the moment she was arrested, trying to minimize her role, claiming Marlene had initiated everything. She'd provided investigators with recordings of their conversations going back 18 months. Conversations where Marlene discussed targeting Garrett specifically for his inheritance prospects. The partner claimed she'd tried to talk Marlene out of it at first, that she'd only gotten involved when Marlene threatened to attempt the fraud alone, and inevitably get caught. It was a lie, of course, but the recordings were real, and they painted Marlene as the mastermind rather than the student. The federal prosecutor had decided to make this a showcase case, something that would send a message about elder financial abuse and inheritance fraud. They'd scheduled a press conference for the morning before court, would lay out the evidence in broad strokes, and make sure everyone understood the scope of the conspiracy. Marlene's Instagram fame would work against her now, making her the perfect face for this type of crime. The wellness guru who'd preached about positive energy while stealing from her husband's dead grandmother would become a cautionary tale, a warning to others who might think elderly relatives were easy targets. Garrett spent that night at my house, unable to sleep, going through photo albums from his childhood. He found pictures of his grandmother's house, the one Marlene had convinced him to sell so quickly after the funeral. There were photos of birthday parties in that backyard, Christmas mornings in that living room, his grandmother teaching him to cook in that kitchen. Each image was a reminder of what had been lost. Not just money, but a family home full of memories. He told me he'd been so lost in grief that Marlene's push to sell had seemed like relief from painful reminders. Now he understood she'd been calculating the value while he'd been mourning the loss. Vera came by with coffee and news from her network of contacts. The investigation had expanded beyond what anyone expected, with federal agents executing search warrants in 4 states simultaneously. The partners' other students were being arrested, their victims being contacted, the full scope of the criminal enterprise being exposed. Conservative estimates suggested over $12 million had been stolen from elderly victims over 3 years. Marlene's $940,000 was actually one of the smaller thefts, though it had been the one that finally brought everything crashing down. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The morning of court arrived gray and drizzling, appropriate weather for what was about to unfold. Marlene arrived in the Mercedes she could no longer afford, wearing the same designer dress she'd worn 3 days ago, now wrinkled and stained. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup absent, the Instagram perfection completely gone. She looked around the courthouse steps frantically, probably hoping her partner would appear with some miracle solution. Instead, she found news cameras, reporters, and a crowd of people who'd been following the story online. Someone shouted, "Thief!" and others took up the chant until security intervened. The federal prosecutor's press conference was devastating in its simplicity. They displayed charts showing how the money had moved, photos of the luxury goods purchased, screenshots of messages between conspirators discussing their crimes. They didn't need to embellish or dramatize. The facts were damning enough. When they showed the photo of Marlene at her wedding, smiling next to Garrett while allegedly already planning to steal his inheritance, several people in the crowd gasped. The prosecutor ended by stating this was one of the most calculated cases of familial financial abuse they'd ever prosecuted, and they intended to seek the maximum possible sentence. Inside the courtroom, Marlene sat with her public defender, a tired-looking man who'd clearly advised her to plead guilty, but been ignored. She kept turning around, scanning the gallery, looking for her partner who she still believed might save her. When the prosecutor began presenting evidence, her face went through a series of transformations that would have been fascinating if they weren't so pathetic. Confusion when they mentioned her partner's arrest. Shock when they revealed the $400,000 in cash, and finally a rage so pure it transformed her features into something ugly and primitive. "She took my money!" Marlene screamed, standing up despite her lawyer's attempts to stop her. "That was supposed to be mine. We agreed on the split." The judge gavelled for order, but Marlene couldn't stop herself. Years of careful control shattered in seconds as she realized her partner had planned to leave her behind with nothing. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Marlene actually vomited right there in court, adding physical humiliation to her emotional destruction. The bailiff stepped back in disgust, while someone called for cleaning supplies. The prosecutor played recordings from the partner's laptop, conversations where Marlene laughed about Garrett's gullibility, mocked his grief over his grandmother, planned how she'd gaslight him into thinking any financial problems were his fault. In one recording, she described the exact words she'd use to convince him to sell the house, how she'd cry about wanting to start fresh, wanting to build their future without the weight of the past. She'd rehearsed her manipulation like an actress preparing for a role, and Garrett had to leave the courtroom when he heard his own words of comfort played back, the ones he'd offered while she'd been pretending to grieve with him. My lawyer presented our civil case next, seeking full restitution and damages for emotional distress. He showed the court photos of my face after Marlene had slapped me, medical records documenting the assault, witness statements from neighbors who'd heard the confrontation. But more powerful was his presentation of my mother's life, how she'd worked as a seamstress for 40 years, saved every penny, lived frugally so her great-grandson could have opportunities she never did. He showed pictures of her modest house, her simple belongings, the handwritten notes she'd left about wanting Garrett to use the money wisely. The contrast with Marlene's designer goods was stark and damning. The judge called a recess after a particularly disturbing piece of evidence was presented. The FBI had found a safety deposit box registered under a false name, and inside were documents that suggested Marlene's plans went beyond simple theft. There were fake suicide notes dated months ago, designed to frame Garrett if anything went wrong. She'd planned to disappear and make it look like Garrett had killed her, leaving evidence that would send him to prison while she started a new life with the stolen money. The revelation was so shocking that even the prosecutor seemed disturbed. Desmond's testimony came via video link from Nevada, where he was in custody. He looked terrible, sweating through his orange jumpsuit, hand shaking as he held the microphone. He admitted to receiving $200,000 from Marlene, confirmed she'd told him it was Garrett's inheritance that they deserved to share. But then he revealed something new. Marlene had done this before, years ago, with a different man in California. That marriage had ended when the husband discovered missing funds, but there hadn't been enough evidence to prosecute. This was a pattern, not a one-time crime of opportunity. She was a serial predator who'd finally been caught. When court resumed, Marlene's partner appeared on screen from federal custody, orange jumpsuit matching Desmond's, face haggard from a night of interrogation. She tried to maintain that Marlene had initiated everything, but the prosecutor presented emails from years ago where the partner had outlined similar schemes, had provided templates for the fraud, and had given Marlene contact information for offshore banks. The partner's attempt to throw Marlene under the bus collapsed when faced with her own detailed planning documents. Both women were trapped by their own meticulous record-keeping, their conspiracy documented in excruciating detail. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom like thunder, demanding order after Marlene's vomiting incident. She sat shackled now, wrists and ankles bound after her outburst, the designer dress torn and stained, her face streaked with tears and bile. The transformation from Instagram influencer to federal defendant was complete, witnessed by hundreds in person and thousands online as courtroom artists sketched her breakdown in real time. The woman who'd posted daily about manifesting abundance and positive energy was now manifesting only the consequences of her crimes, and the energy in the room was electric with anticipation of justice. The prosecutor stood to deliver what would become known as one of the most devastating closing arguments in federal fraud cases. He began with my mother, showing her photograph from 50 years ago when she'd bought the house with her husband, my father. They'd paid $8,500 for it, a fortune for immigrants who'd worked factory jobs and saved every penny. Over 5 decades, through recessions and recoveries, through raising children and welcoming grandchildren, that house had grown in value to $940,000. It wasn't just property, it was the American dream realized through sacrifice and patience. And Marlene had stolen it in 3 months. The evidence was presented in chronological order, starting from the day Marlene had first researched Garrett online, 2 years before they'd even met. The prosecutor showed her search history, recovered from her laptop, with queries about software engineer salaries, inheritance law, and how to identify wealthy families. She'd attended tech conferences specifically to hunt for targets, had created fake profiles on dating apps to research potential victims. Garrett had been on a short list of 3 men, chosen because his grandmother was elderly, and he'd recently posted about her declining health on social media. Every moment of their courtship had been calculated, documented in emails to her partner where she'd referred to romance as investment groundwork. My lawyer presented our civil damages next, calculating not just the stolen money, but the emotional destruction left behind. He showed medical records indicating Garrett had been prescribed antidepressants, anxiety medication, sleeping pills since discovering the theft. He presented therapy bills, showed how a confident software engineer had become someone who couldn't trust his own judgment, couldn't form new relationships, couldn't even look at his bank statements without panic attacks. The financial theft was quantifiable at $940,000, but the emotional theft was immeasurable. How do you put a price on the ability to trust another human being? How do you quantify the loss of belief in love itself? The partner appeared on screen again, this time with her own lawyer standing beside her in what looked like a federal courthouse in Nevada. The video feed was crystal clear, showing every line of stress on her face, every nervous twitch of her fingers against the table. She wore an orange jumpsuit now, a far cry from the designer clothes she'd flaunted in the photos with Marlene. Her lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, whispered something in her ear before she began speaking. She revealed that Marlene had successfully completed 2 prior scams, smaller amounts that hadn't triggered federal attention, but had destroyed lives nonetheless. The first victim had been an elderly professor in Oregon, who'd lost $200,000 over 18 months. The professor had been too embarrassed to pursue charges, telling his family he'd made bad investments rather than admit he'd been conned by a woman 40 years younger. The partner provided bank statements showing the systematic drain of his retirement accounts, each withdrawal carefully timed to avoid triggering fraud alerts. The second victim was a retired contractor in Arizona who'd lost $450,000, convinced by his family to let it go rather than face the public humiliation of admitting he'd fallen for a romance scam at 78 years old. The documentation showed Marlene had used different names, but the same techniques, building trust through manufactured vulnerability, then striking when the victims were most emotionally invested. The courtroom fell silent as the partner continued her testimony, her voice growing stronger as she realized cooperation was her only path to a reduced sentence. She described how Marlene had trained her in the art of manipulation, teaching her to identify marks at upscale grocery stores and coffee shops in affluent neighborhoods. They'd look for wedding rings on elderly men, signs of wealth like expensive watches or well-maintained luxury cars, then research them online before making first contact. The preparation for each scam took months of surveillance and planning, studying routines and identifying psychological weaknesses to exploit. Marlene's reaction to this betrayal was volcanic and immediate. She stood despite her shackles, the chains clanking against the defendant's table as she rose. Her face turned a deep crimson, veins bulging at her temples as she screamed obscenities at the screen. The words that came out of her mouth made even hardened court reporters flinch, their fingers pausing over stenograph keys. She called her partner names that mixed profanity with accusations of betrayal, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed off the courtroom's wood-paneled walls. The bailiffs had to physically restrain her as she tried to lunge toward the monitor, one officer grabbing her shoulders while another secured her waist. Her face contorted with rage that went beyond anything she'd shown before, spittle flying from her mouth as she continued screaming, even while being forced back into her chair. This wasn't the calculated manipulator we'd seen for weeks. This was someone whose entire world was collapsing in real time. Every ally was turning against her. Every carefully constructed plan was failing. Every lie was being exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The partner watched impassively from her own courtroom, already moving past their partnership to focus on saving herself from the conspiracy they'd built together. When Marlene finally stopped screaming, she sat panting in her chair, her carefully styled hair now disheveled, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. The judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation when Marlene began talking to herself, her lips moving in silent conversation with invisible companions. She'd turn her head as if listening to someone beside her, then respond with nods or shakes of her head. Sometimes she'd laugh, a hollow sound that sent chills through the gallery. The court psychiatrist, a woman with 30 years of experience, would later testify that this wasn't insanity, but rather the collapse of a carefully constructed false personality. For years, Marlene had been playing a role so completely that she'd lost track of who she really was underneath the performance. The masks had been worn so long they'd fused to her face, and now that they were being ripped away, she was discovering that nothing remained but the crimes she'd committed, and the emptiness where her soul should have been. Garrett took the stand for his victim impact statement on a gray Thursday morning, rain streaming down the courtroom windows like tears. He'd dreaded this moment, but needed to speak his truth. His hands shook as he unfolded a piece of paper covered in his handwriting, the words he'd written and rewritten dozens of times. He spoke quietly about the grandmother who'd raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7, how she'd worked double shifts at the hospital to pay for his college, never complaining about her aching feet or tired eyes. He described how she'd celebrated every achievement like it was her own, keeping a scrapbook of his accomplishments that she showed to anyone who'd look. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described finding out about the theft. The moment he'd realized every tender word from Marlene had been calculated manipulation. Every "I love you" had been a lie. Every shared moment a performance designed to lower his guard. The morning coffees they'd shared, her hand touching his as she passed him the cup, had been reconnaissance missions to study his routines. The vacations they'd planned together had been opportunities to isolate him from family who might have seen through her act. But the worst part, he said, his voice breaking completely, was learning about the fake suicide notes she'd prepared to frame him. The woman he'd loved, whom he'd planned to spend his remaining years with, had been willing to send him to prison for murder to cover her crimes. She'd written practice versions of his supposed confession, each one more convincing than the last. The federal prosecutor, a tall woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, then revealed something that hadn't been in any of the preliminary evidence. She wheeled in a cart containing evidence bags, each one labeled and sealed. The FBI had found Marlene's real laptop during a second search of the storage unit. Not the sanitized one she'd shown Garrett, but the one she'd hidden inside a false bottom of an old suitcase. The laptop's hard drive contained horrors that made even veteran investigators sick. On it were detailed profiles of 17 potential future targets across the country, elderly people with substantial assets, and vulnerable family members who could be exploited. Each profile included photographs taken without the subject's knowledge, financial estimates based on public records and social media investigation, and detailed psychological assessments. She'd been building a database of future victims with the precision of a serial killer, collecting trophies. The profiles included notes about medications the targets took, their doctors' names, their daily routines mapped out in exhausting detail. Garrett had simply been the first successful mark in what was planned to be a career of exploitation spanning decades. The scope of planned evil was staggering in its ambition and cruelty. She'd even created a rating system, scoring potential victims on vulnerability, asset accessibility, and likelihood of family interference. Each profile the prosecutor displayed was more disturbing than the last. She'd identified widowers at grief counseling groups she'd attended under false pretenses, pretending to mourn a husband who never existed. She'd found their adult children on social media, studying their posts for signs of family tension she could exploit. One profile included extensive notes about a man whose son had special needs, documenting how she could use offering to help with caregiving as a way to ingratiate herself. Another detailed a woman whose daughter struggled with addiction, outlining how offering emotional support and guidance could provide access to family finances while the daughter was in treatment. The preparation that had gone into these profiles showed this wasn't opportunistic crime, but predatory behavior that would have continued indefinitely if she hadn't been caught. She'd researched nursing homes where she could volunteer to identify vulnerable residents with visiting families. She'd joined online support groups for adult children of aging parents, harvesting their stories of struggle and frustration to better understand family dynamics she could manipulate. The prosecutor showed screenshots of Marlene's posts in these groups, offering sympathy and advice while secretly cataloging potential victims. The sentencing phase came immediately, the judge seeing no reason to delay. Federal conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and the state would pursue attempted murder charges based on the journal evidence. Each charge carried its maximum sentence, to run consecutively, not concurrently. The total came to 47 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for someone Marlene's age. She showed no reaction to this, sitting slumped in her chair like a broken doll, the designer dress now looking like a costume from a play that had closed forever. The woman who'd wanted to live in luxury in the Cayman Islands would instead spend her remaining years in a federal cell. As marshals prepared to take Marlene away, she turned to look at me one last time. There was nothing in her eyes, no hatred, no regret, no emotion at all. They were as empty as the promises she'd made to my son, as hollow as the love she'd pretended to feel. I thought about my mother, about how she would have been horrified to know her death had triggered such evil. But she also would have been proud that we'd fought back, that we'd refused to let Marlene walk away with her life's work. Justice isn't revenge, but sometimes they walk hand in hand toward the same destination. The media coverage that night was extensive, with every major network covering the story of the Instagram influencer who'd planned to murder her husband after stealing his inheritance. Marlene's social media accounts were flooded with comments from former followers expressing shock, disgust, and in some cases admitting they'd suspected something was off about her perfect life. The wellness app she'd promoted had its servers shut down after someone hacked it and replaced the meditation music with recordings from the trial. The digital footprint she'd been so proud of became a monument to her crimes, forever preserved in the internet's unforgiving memory. My lawyer and I had dinner that night at a quiet restaurant, both of us exhausted from the emotional toll of the trial. He told me the federal prosecutor was recommending Marlene serve her time in maximum security, given the murder planning and flight risk. Her partner would get 15 to 20 years, Desmond would get 5 to 7, and the various other participants in the wider scheme would face their own justice. The network of elder abuse had been destroyed, the money mostly recovered, the victims given some measure of closure. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was more than many people got, and it had saved my son's life. 3 months have passed since Marlene was sentenced to 47 years in federal prison. The number still echoes in my mind sometimes, usually in the quiet hours before dawn when I can't sleep. 47 years for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and attempted murder. The judge had delivered the sentence with cold finality, noting that Marlene had shown no remorse even after everything was exposed. She'd actually smiled when they led her away, probably still believing someone would save her, that some miracle would undo what she'd done. Nobody came. Nobody ever came. Garrett lives with me now, not because he needs a place to stay, but because we're both learning how to trust again. He makes breakfast every Sunday, the same pancakes his grandmother used to make, using her recipe card that's stained with decades of use. We don't talk about Marlene during these mornings. We talk about his work, about the weather, about anything except the woman who nearly destroyed us both. The silence around her name isn't denial. It's healing. Some wounds close better without constant examination. The money came back slowly, filtered through legal channels and international banking agreements that required signatures in triplicate and notarization at every step. The process felt like trying to squeeze water from a stone, each dollar fought for and documented. Of the $940,000 that Marlene and her partner had stolen, we recovered $620,000 after 14 months of legal battles. The rest had vanished into attorney fees that accumulated like snowdrifts, frozen accounts in Caribbean banks that refused to cooperate, and luxury purchases that had depreciated the moment Marlene had carried them out of the stores. The federal recovery agent assigned to our case was a patient woman with thick glasses who explained each setback with the weariness of someone who'd delivered bad news too many times. She sat at our kitchen table on a humid Tuesday afternoon, spreading out forms that detailed where every penny had gone. Legal fees alone had consumed $180,000, she explained, her finger tracing the itemized bills from 3 different law firms. International banking lawyers charged $1,500 an hour, and they'd needed hundreds of hours to navigate the maze Marlene had created. Garrett wanted none of the recovered money when it finally arrived via electronic transfer on a gray March morning. He signed every penny over to a fund for elder fraud victims without hesitation, his hand steady as he wrote his signature on the donation forms. The charity director, an older woman who'd lost her own mother's savings to a similar scam, cried when she received the check. She said his grandmother would have preferred helping others to enriching lawyers. And she was right. The donation made the local news, a brief segment between weather and sports, showing Garrett handing over an oversized check while trying to avoid the cameras. It was a small moment of good in an ocean of bad. But sometimes small moments are all we get. The storage unit company had sent us a final notice about Marlene's belongings 3 months after her sentencing. Everything had been cataloged as evidence, photographed from every angle, then released back to be dealt with. Nobody wanted to claim it, this monument to greed and deception. Last week, I received a letter from Marlene, written on prison stationery, the cheap paper thin enough to see through. The prison allows her 1 letter per month to non-legal contacts, and she chose to waste it on me. Her handwriting was smaller than before, cramped and angry, as if the words themselves were imprisoned. She wrote about the unfairness of her situation in language that alternated between self-pity and rage. She claimed her partner had orchestrated everything, and she'd been a victim of manipulation. She insisted the system had conspired against her because she was a woman trying to succeed in a man's world. She accused me of ruining her life by involving the authorities over something as trivial as a slap, conveniently forgetting the $940,000 she'd stolen, and the murder she'd been planning. Not one word of apology appeared in those 4 pages of complaints. Not one acknowledgement of what she'd stolen or who she'd hurt. The narcissism was so complete it was almost fascinating, like watching a snake eat its own tail. I burned the letter in my backyard fire pit that evening, watching the smoke rise into the spring air and disappear. The paper curled and blackened, her words turning to ash that scattered in the wind. Some messages don't deserve responses, and some people don't deserve forgiveness. The fire felt cleansing, like burning away the last physical reminder of her presence in our lives. Vera visits twice a week now, every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, bringing coffee from the expensive place downtown and gossip from her banking contacts. She's become something between a friend and a family member, this woman who'd recognized fraud when everyone else had seen romance. Last Tuesday, she brought news that the investigation had spread wider than anyone expected, uncovering similar schemes in 12 states from Maine to California. The FBI had created a task force specifically for elder fraud targeting inheritance money. 43 elderly victims had been identified so far, their stories variations on the same heartbreaking theme. There were trusted family members who'd turned predator when money became tight, inheritances that had vanished into offshore accounts faster than they could be traced. Dreams of leaving legacies that had been sold for designer handbags and luxury cars that were already being repossessed. The partners' network had been completely dismantled, its teachers and students all facing federal charges under RICO statutes. Marlene had been the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire criminal enterprise. The prosecutor called it one of the largest elder fraud rings ever discovered, though that was little comfort to the victims. The storage unit had been auctioned last month after evidence processing was complete. The auction drew a small crowd of bargain hunters who had no idea what they were bidding on. Someone bought Marlene's designer goods for pennies on the dollar. a young woman who squealed with delight at finding authentic Hermès bags for less than the price of knockoffs. She didn't know or care about their history, about the tears and betrayal they represented. The Cartier watches Marlene had flaunted on Instagram sold to a dealer who'd resell them for 10 times what he paid. The designer dresses she'd worn, like armor, went to a vintage shop downtown. There's something fitting about that. Her precious things scattered to the wind, just like the family she'd tried to destroy, becoming mundane objects stripped of their power. Garrett started therapy the day after the trial ended, finding a therapist who specialized in what they called betrayal trauma. The therapist's office was in a converted Victorian house, painted cheerful yellow with a garden full of wildflowers. Twice a week, Garrett would spend an hour in that safe space, learning to recognize the red flags he'd missed and the manipulation tactics that had seemed like love. He told me the therapist had treated other victims of romance scams, that there was a whole vocabulary for what he'd experienced. Love bombing, future faking, trauma bonding, terms that gave names to the pain and made it somehow more manageable. He's not ready to date again. Might never be. But progress shows in small ways. He's stopped flinching when women speak to him at work. He can watch romantic movies without feeling sick. Last week, he had coffee with a colleague. Just a friendly conversation about a work project. And he didn't spend the entire time analyzing her motives. Progress comes in small steps, and we celebrate each one with quiet recognition that healing isn't linear. Desmond died in prison last month, found unresponsive in his cell on a Sunday morning. Heart attack, the official report said, though inmates whispered about debts to the wrong people and pills that looked like aspirin but weren't. He'd tried to gamble even behind bars, betting commissary items on sports games, owing more than he could ever pay. The prison chaplain called to inform us, his voice carefully neutral as he delivered the news. Marlene wasn't allowed to attend the funeral due to security concerns. Not that she would have gone anyway. Their relationship had ended the moment she'd learned he'd cooperated with prosecutors. Blood might be thicker than water, but it's not thicker than 47 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. We held a small service for Desmond, just Garrett and me and Vera, at the cemetery where my mother was buried. We didn't know what to say about a man who'd helped plan to murder his nephew, so we mostly stood in silence while rain pattered on our umbrellas. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates, paid for by the state. No loving father or brother inscriptions, no Bible verses about forgiveness. Just a name on granite, already beginning to weather. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves can breathe again. I replaced the chair where Marlene had sat during that first confrontation. Donated it to charity because I couldn't stand looking at it. The spot on my cheek where she'd slapped me doesn't hurt anymore. Hasn't for months. But I sometimes touch it absently, a habit I can't seem to break. That slap had been her biggest mistake, the action that had brought federal investigators into our lives. If she'd just left when I'd said no, she might have gotten away with everything. The stolen money would have disappeared completely. And more importantly, my son might be dead from antifreeze poisoning by now, buried next to his grandmother, with a murderer crying fake tears at his funeral. Money leaves fingerprints, but love leaves something stronger. It leaves resilience, the ability to rebuild after devastation. It leaves wisdom, the knowledge of what truly matters. It leaves bonds that can't be broken by lies or theft or attempted murder. Marlene tried to steal $940,000, but she couldn't steal what really mattered. The connection between a father and son, the memory of a grandmother's love, the strength to seek justice when it would have been easier to surrender. Would you have done what I did? Pursued justice even when it meant destroying your own family? You can be a victim, or you can fight back. I fought back, and I won. Thank you for listening to my story.